They dispatched 9,500 ships to attack Earth. Only 17 returned. Part 1. The Verdict of the Conclave. The Vethrani had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever made them afraid. They controlled over 4,000 star systems across the Orion Spur, and their warships moved through the galaxy like predators through still water, silent and absolute and unchallenged. Their capital world of Serethis Prime was a monument to their dominance, a planet wrapped in floating citadels of black stone and living metal, where the ruling body known as the Conclave made decisions that shaped the fate of entire civilizations. It was on this world, in a chamber carved from a single mountain, that High Arbiter Zorith Vel stood before the assembled leaders and presented the findings of a long-range reconnaissance probe sent to an unremarkable yellow star in a forgotten arm of the galaxy. "The system is called Sol," he said, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "Third planet from the star is home to a species that calls itself human." He activated the display, and the chamber filled with images. A blue and green world, covered in oceans and clouds, and sprawling cities that glittered at night like scattered embers. The Conclave's members watched with mild curiosity, and nothing more. Zorath continued, "They are young, barely 200 years into spaceflight, and they have not yet established colonies beyond their own solar system in any meaningful way." A low murmur of disinterest passed through the chamber, and several of the elder arbiters shifted in their seats, as though wondering why their time was being wasted on primitives. But then Zorath raised one hand, and the display changed. New data filled the air, charts and graphs and projections that climbed upward at angles that should not have been possible. "This is their rate of technological advancement," Zorath said quietly. The Adhari, the science cast of the Conclave, had analyzed humanity's development across the past 3 centuries, and what they found did not follow any known pattern of species evolution. Most civilizations advanced in slow curves, their technology growing steadily over millennia, the way a tree grows, patient and predictable. Humanity's curve was not a curve at all. It was a line that bent upward like a blade, accelerating with every generation, doubling and then doubling again, feeding on itself in a way the Adhari had never recorded in any species across the entire history of the Conclave. "At their current rate," Zorath said, "they will reach technological parity with the Conclave within 2 generations, and they will surpass us within 3. The silence in the chamber was no longer one of disinterest. It was the silence of predators who had just realized that something in the tall grass was growing teeth. Elder Arbiter Sethan, the oldest member of the Conclave, leaned forward and spoke in a voice like cracking stone. "You are telling us that a species still bound to a single world will overtake an empire that is ruled for 12,000 years. "I am telling you what the data says," Zorath replied, "and the data does not lie." The debate that followed lasted 9 hours, but in truth, the outcome was decided in the first 9 minutes. The Conclave had maintained its empire through one simple principle. No species was ever allowed to become a threat. They had done this before, dozens of times across the millennia, snuffing out civilizations that showed too much promise, before that promise could become a danger. It was not cruelty in their eyes. It was survival. The vote was unanimous. Extermination. The order was given to assemble the largest fleet in over 1,000 years, a force so overwhelming that the operation would be finished before it truly began. They believed. Fleet Marshal Kalith Sorvan was chosen to lead the armada, and she accepted the command with the calm confidence of a soldier who had never known defeat. She was tall even by Vethrani standards, with sharp features, and eyes like polished obsidian that missed nothing and forgave less. She had led the subjugation of the Rathani, the burning of the Vorix Nebula colonies, and the systematic dismantling of the Chalur defense network. Every campaign had ended the same way, with the enemy broken, and the Vethrani flag planted in the ashes of whatever world had dared to resist. 9,500 warships gathered above Serathis Prime, a fleet so vast that it dimmed the stars when viewed from the planet's surface. Dreadnoughts the size of mountains hung beside carriers that could deploy thousands of fighters each, and between them moved cruisers and destroyers and bombers in formations so precise they looked like living geometry. Was the most powerful military force ever assembled by the Conclave, and it was aimed at a single world, orbiting a single unremarkable star. Kalith stood on the bridge of her flagship, a void sovereign, and reviewed the intelligence dossier on humanity one final time before departure. She read about their biology, fragile, short-lived, dependent on a narrow range of environmental conditions. She read about their society, fractured into hundreds of competing nations with no unified government and no central military command. She read about their technology, primitive by Conclave standards, barely capable of sustained fusion power, and still reliant on chemical propulsion for much of their space travel. All of it confirmed what the Conclave believed. This would be simple. But then Kalith reached a section near the back of the dossier, a section that the military planners had marked as low priority, and that most of her officers had not bothered to. It was a summary of human history. Not their scientific history or their political history, but their military history. Kalith read it slowly, and as she read, something cold settled in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. The humans had been fighting wars since before they had written language. They had fought with stones and sticks, and then with metal and fire, and then with chemicals and atoms, and finally with machines that could think faster than any living mind. They had killed each other in numbers that staggered comprehension, millions upon millions dead in conflicts that spanned their entire globe, wars fought over land and resources and ideology, and sometimes for reasons so abstract that even the humans themselves could not fully explain them. They had split the atom, and the first thing they did with that knowledge was build a weapon. They had gone to their own moon, not out of pure curiosity, but because two of them, their nations, were locked in a contest to prove which one was more powerful. Every single leap in their technology had been driven by or accelerated by war. Kalith closed the dossier and stared out at the stars for a long moment. Then she pushed the thought aside. It did not matter how many wars the humans had fought among themselves. They had never fought the Vethrani. She gave the order, and the armada entered slipstream, 9,500 ships folding space around themselves, and vanishing from Serathis Prime like a held breath finally released. When they emerged at the edge of the Sol system days later, Earth was nothing more than a pale blue dot hanging in the black. Kalith looked at it from her bridge and felt nothing but certainty. "All ships advance," she commanded. "Standard extermination formation." The fleet moved forward like a tide of iron, and behind them, the stars watched in silence as the largest armada in 1,000 years closed in on a small blue world that did not yet know it was supposed to be afraid. They dispatched 9,500 ships to attack Earth. Only 17 returned. Part 2. The Silence Before. Adeze Okonkwo was 26 years old and running on her fourth cup of coffee when she noticed the thing that would change the course of human history. She was a PhD student at the University of Johannesburg, working the night shift at a deep space telescope array in the Karoo Desert, calibrating sensors and running routine scans of the outer solar system. The kind of work that was mostly boring and occasionally mind-numbing, but every now and then produced something beautiful. Tonight, it produced something terrifying. A gravitational anomaly at the edge of the solar system. A ripple in the fabric of space itself, as if something very large and very fast had just punched a hole through reality, and come out the other side. Adeze stared at the data for 11 minutes before she trusted what she was seeing. Then she flagged it and sent it up the chain. It was dismissed twice. Reviewer called it sensor noise, and the second called it an asteroid interaction. But Adeze had seen asteroid interactions, and this was not that. This was something moving with purpose, and it was moving toward Earth. 6 hours later, a military artificial intelligence buried deep in a defense network beneath the Swiss Alps processed the same data through theoretical models that had been built decades ago and never once triggered. The models were designed to detect one thing: compressed space transit, the theoretical signature of faster-than-light travel. The AI triggered. Within the hour, every government on Earth had been briefed, and the world as humanity knew it ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet notification on secured channels that read simply, "Non-human fleet detected at system boundary. Estimated 9,000+ vessels. Trajectory confirms approach toward Earth." What happened next was something that no species in the galaxy had ever done, and no Vethrani analyst had ever predicted. Human did not fracture. It consolidated. The old rivalries did not vanish. The Americans still distrusted the Chinese, and the Russians still bristled at NATO. And 100 smaller tensions still hummed beneath the surface like electrical current. But in the space of a single day, all of it became background noise. It was as if the entire species had looked up at the sky and collectively decided that whatever they were angry about with each other could wait, because something out there was coming to kill all of them. The United Nations Interplanetary Defense Council, a body that had existed for decades as a mostly symbolic organization that held conferences and published papers, suddenly became the most important institution in human history. Its general secretary was a woman named Lena Vasquez, a former Argentine naval officer turned diplomat, who had spent her career navigating bureaucracies and political minefields with a calm ruthlessness that earned her respect from people who otherwise agreed on nothing. She took command, and she did not waste time with speeches or reassurances. She called an emergency session of every military leader on the planet, and she told them the truth. "We are almost certainly outgunned," she said, her voice steady and clear through the secure channel, "and we are absolutely outnumbered. But this is our home, and we are not leaving it, and they are not taking it." What she revealed next changed the mood in the room from dread to something darker and more dangerous, something that looked almost like hope. Humanity had been preparing for this. Not with a single grand plan, not with some secret world government pulling strings behind the curtain, but in the way humanity had always prepared for threats, chaotically, redundantly, competitively, with dozens of nations and thousands of organizations all independently building pieces of a puzzle that none of them knew was being assembled. The result was a defense network that was ugly and sprawling and magnificently lethal. The Aegis network was the first layer, thousands of weapons platforms hidden among orbital debris and asteroid mining stations across the inner solar system. Armed with kinetic impactors and directed energy weapons and nuclear-pumped X-ray lasers that could cut through starship armor like a hot wire through plastic. The Hive was the brain, not a single artificial intelligence, but millions of them, a decentralized warfare system running on military hardware and civilian hardware and personal computers and even gaming consoles, all networked together into a tactical mind that could not be killed because it had no center, no headquarters, no single point of failure. The swarm was the teeth, trillions of autonomous microdrones stored in orbital warehouses, each one no bigger than a human fist, each carrying a shaped explosive charge designed to breach armored hulls, and all of them capable of operating independently or in coordinated clouds of millions. Project Longbow was the fist, railgun arrays on the moon, and scattered through the asteroid belt. Massive electromagnetic accelerators that could hurl tungsten rods at 8% of the speed of light, turning simple metal into relativistic kill vehicles that carried more energy than nuclear warheads. And then there was the dead hand. Vasquez did not discuss the dead hand in the open briefing, but every senior military leader knew about it. It was humanity's final contingency, the last and ugliest card in the deck. Antimatter charges seeded throughout the Oort cloud at the farthest edges of the solar system, designed to detonate simultaneously if Earth fell, creating a debris storm so vast and so violent that the Sol system would become uninhabitable for thousands of years. If humanity died, then no one else would ever live here. Either. It was mutually assured destruction taken to a cosmic scale, and it was exactly the kind of thing that only humans would think of. Vasquez ended the briefing with words that would later be carved into a memorial wall in Geneva. They think they are coming to kill a civilization, she said, but they have made a mistake that every predator eventually makes. They have confused quiet with weakness, and they have assumed that because we fight among ourselves, we do not know how to fight together. She paused and looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting to every command center on Earth and in orbit. We did not build these weapons for them, she said. We built them for each other, and they are very good at what they do. Across the solar system, the machines of war woke up. Railguns on the lunar surface rotated on their mounts and locked onto the coordinates where the alien fleet would arrive. Drone swarms stirred in there, warehouses like hornets sensing a vibration in their nest. The hive expanded its network, absorbing processing power from every connected device on Earth. 1 billion machines linking together into something that was not quite alive, but very far from dead. Soldiers and sailors and pilots reported to their posts, and civilians who had no posts found ways to help anyway, because that was what humans did when the sky was falling. They got busy. In the outer solar system, the first Vethrani scout ships crossed the defense perimeter, and their sensors immediately detected the human installations. They reported back to Fleet Marshal Khalith Sorvan that the primitives appeared to have defensive fortifications throughout their system. Khalith reviewed the report and was unimpressed. She had seen fortifications before on a dozen conquered worlds, and they had never changed the outcome. Continue advance, she ordered. Clear the outer installations first. Then, proceed to the primary target. Her officers obeyed without hesitation because this was what they had always done, and it had always worked. The vanguard of 600 warships pushed forward into the Sol system, their weapons powered and their shields raised, moving with the confidence of an empire that had never learned what it felt like to be wrong. On the moon, a young technician watched her targeting display fill with red contacts, and whispered to no one in particular, "Here they come." The railguns hummed, the drones woke, and humanity held its breath. They dispatched 9,500 ships to attack Earth. Only 17 returned. Part 3. The Grinder. The first shot of the war was fired from a railgun, buried 300 meters beneath the surface of the moon, and it traveled across 400,000 kilometers of empty space in just under 2 seconds. It was a tungsten rod, nothing more, a bar of dense metal about 2 meters long and 20 centimeters wide, with no warhead and no guidance system and no explosive of any kind. It did not need any of those things because it was moving at 8% of the speed of light. When it struck the lead Vethrani destroyer, the ship did not explode so much as it ceased to exist. The kinetic energy of the impact, converting the entire forward section into superheated plasma that tore through the vessel from bow to stern and kept going, punching through the cruiser behind it and wounding a third ship before the energy finally dispersed. The Vethrani had never encountered anything like it. Their shields were masterworks of engineering, layered energy barriers designed to absorb and redirect plasma fire and particle beams, and every other directed energy weapon known to galactic civilization. They were not designed for a species that had decided the best weapon was simply a very heavy object moving very fast. The first volley from Project Longbow consisted of over 300 rounds, fired from railgun arrays on the moon, in the asteroid belt, and from hidden platforms scattered across the inner system. 80 Vethrani ships were destroyed in under 4 minutes, and the Vanguard had not yet fired a single shot in return. On the bridge of the Void Sovereign Fleet, Marshal Kalith Sorvan watched the casualty reports cascade across her tactical display, and for the first time in her long career, felt something she did not immediately recognize. It took her a moment to name it. It was surprise. She recovered quickly because she was a soldier, and soldiers who froze in the face of the unexpected did not live to become fleet marshals. She ordered the fleet to disperse, widening formation to reduce the effectiveness of the railgun strikes, and she pushed forward with the full weight of 9,000 ships because the mathematics still favored her. 80 ships lost was painful, but it was not decisive. She still had an overwhelming numerical advantage, and her ships were individually superior in every measurable way. Faster, better armed, better shielded, crewed by officers trained in academies that had been producing warriors for millennia. The humans had surprised her once. She would not let them surprise her again. But humanity was not finished surprising her. As the main body of the Vethrani fleet pushed through the outer system and into the asteroid belt, they entered what the human commanders had privately named the Grinder. The asteroid belt was not empty. It had never been empty. Decades humanity had been threading weapons platforms through the belt, disguised as mining stations and survey probes and communication relays. Thousands of them sitting dark and silent and patient, like spiders in a web. They activated all at once. Directed energy weapons opened fire from behind the advancing fleet, striking engines and shield generators from angles the Vethrani formation was not designed to protect. Kinetic impactors launched from hidden launchers among the asteroids, crude but effective. Chunks of iron and nickel accelerated to tremendous speeds on short-range magnetic rails. And then the swarm came. The orbital warehouses opened, and the drones poured out like water from a broken dam. Not thousands, not millions, but billions of them. A cloud of autonomous machines so vast that it registered on Vethrani sensors as a solid object. Each drone was small enough to hold in a human hand, and each one carried a shaped charge that could punch through 3 centimeters of warship armor. Individually they were nothing. Together they were a plague. The drones did not attack in waves or formations. They swarmed. They crawled across the hulls of Vethrani warships like metallic insects, finding seams in armor plating, and gaps around sensor arrays and the vulnerable joints where weapons turrets met the hull, and they detonated themselves in coordinated patterns that peeled open warships like cans. The Vethrani point defense systems were designed to shoot down missiles and torpedoes and fighter craft, targets that were large enough to track and predict. The drones were too small, too numerous, and too fast. For every 1,000 drones destroyed, 10,000 more took their place. Kalith ordered her fleet to accelerate, to push through the belt and into the inner system, where the drone density might be thinner. But the Hive had anticipated this. The Hive was not a single. It was millions of tactical intelligences running in parallel across every connected system on Earth and in orbit. Each one analyzing a different piece of the battle. Each one adapting independently and sharing what it learned with every other node in the network. The Vethrani battle doctrine was built on a simple assumption. Every enemy had a command structure, and if you destroyed the command structure, the enemy would collapse. The Hive had no command structure. It had no headquarters, no central server, no admiral sitting in a chair giving orders. It was everywhere and nowhere, a distributed intelligence that could not be decapitated because it had no head. And it was learning. Every minute of the battle, the Hive absorbed data on Vethrani's shield frequencies, weapon cycles, formation patterns, and communication protocols. And every minute it updated its tactics across the entire defense network simultaneously, themselves fighting an enemy that got smarter every hour. Calith adapted and counter-adapted, shifting formations and rotating shield frequencies, and deploying electronic warfare systems that jammed human communications in local sectors. She was brilliant, and her officers were experienced, and for every human trick, they found an answer. But the answers came slower each time, and the cost grew higher with each exchange. The breaking point came when the Vethrani deployed their most devastating weapon, the Graviton Lance, a planet-killing beam designed to fracture tectonic plates and tear a world apart from the inside. The weapon ship, a massive vessel called the World Ender, began its charging sequence at a distance of 200,000 kilometers from Earth. The Hive detected the energy buildup in 3 seconds. It identified the weapon type in 7. It calculated the firing window in 12, and it redirected every railgun in the inner solar system, 47 separate platforms, to concentrate fire on a single target. The World Ender was struck by 31 tungsten rounds, traveling at relativistic speeds in a span of 4 seconds. It did not fire. It did not survive. When the light of the explosion faded, there was nothing left but expanding gas, and the Vethrani fleet had lost not just a weapon, but the belief that they could end this battle with a single decisive stroke. The fighting continued for hours more, brutal and close and ugly. A Vethrani dreadnought called the Sorvan's Fist, one of the largest warships in the fleet, was destroyed not by a military vessel, but by a repurposed asteroid mining ship called the Helena, that was crewed by 12 civilian miners from the belt. They had volunteered for the mission knowing exactly what it meant. The Helena accelerated to maximum speed and rammed the dreadnought amidships, punching through its weakened shields and burying itself in the warship's hull before its reactor went critical. 12 miners killed a dreadnought, and the Vethrani could not comprehend it, because no sane species sacrificed civilians in suicide attacks against warships. But humans were not operating on sanity. They were operating on something older and deeper, something that lived in the bones of a species that had charged machine gun nests and stormed beaches and flown burning aircraft into the ground rather than surrender. The Vethrani had come to exterminate a primitive civilization. Instead, they had walked into a killing field designed by a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of destruction. By the 14th hour of the battle, Calith stood on her bridge and looked at the fleet status display and saw something she had never seen before in her career. Over 6,000 of her ships were destroyed or disabled. The humans had taken terrible losses too. Orbital platforms shattered, defense stations burned, thousands of soldiers and civilians dead. But Earth was intact, and the remaining human defenses were not weakening. They were getting stronger. Calith closed her eyes and made a decision that no Vethrani fleet marshal had made in 4,000 years. She opened a channel to all surviving ships and spoke one word: retreat. They dispatched 9,500 ships to attack Earth. Only 17 returned. Part 4. The Pursuit. The retreat was not a clean thing. Calith had hoped it would be, had imagined her surviving ships turning in disciplined formation and withdrawing under cover of their rearguard elements, the way the tactical manuals described, orderly and controlled and dignified. But the tactical manuals had been written by officers who had never actually retreated from anything, and the reality was nothing like the diagrams. The moment the order went out, discipline cracked. Ships that had been holding formation for 14 hours broke away in clusters, their captains no longer willing to maintain positions that kept them between the human weapons and open space. Damaged vessels that should have been covered by escorts were abandoned as the escorts burned hard for the system's edge. Communication channels that had been models of military precision dissolved into overlapping voices shouting coordinates and damage. Reports and desperate requests for assistance that no one was in a position to provide. Kalith watched it happen from the bridge of the Void Sovereign, and she did not scream or rage or threaten. She had seen panic before, in the eyes of conquered species, begging for mercy in the final hours of their civilizations. She had never expected to see it in her own fleet. She forced herself to think clearly, because clear thinking was the only thing that could save what was left of her armada. The human defenses had not stopped firing. The moment the Vethrani fleet began to turn, the Hive recognized the pattern and shifted from defensive to pursuit operations with a speed that was almost cruel in its efficiency. Railgun platforms that had been firing from fixed positions began targeting the engines of retreating ships, aiming not to destroy, but to cripple, to slow them down so the drone swarms could finish the work. The swarm pursued the retreating fleet like a cloud of metallic wasps, billions of drones racing through the void on chemical thrusters that burned hot and brief, latching onto any ship that fell below a certain speed and tearing it apart piece by piece. And the Hive had done something even worse. It had calculated the most likely slipstream entry points, the regions of space where the gravitational conditions were stable enough for the Vethrani drives to engage compressed space transit. And it had repositioned longbow assets to cover those points. The retreating ships had to decelerate to enter slipstream because the drives could not activate at full combat speed. And that deceleration window was the most vulnerable moment in the entire process. Ships that reached the entry points and began to slow were struck by railgun fire from platforms they had not known existed, hidden among the outer system's debris fields and activated only now in the final phase of the battle, like traps that had been waiting all along. Kalith understood then that the humans had planned for this too. They had not just prepared to defend, they had prepared to pursue. She had studied their military history in the dossier, and she remembered now a concept that humans called the pursuit phase, the doctrine that a retreating enemy was at their most vulnerable and that the greatest victories were won not in the main battle, but in the destruction of the fleeing force afterward. The humans had built this into their defense network from the beginning. They had always intended to let nothing leave. Kalith refused to let that be the outcome. She organized what remained of her command structure, pulling together the captains who still answered their communications, and forming them into a rough defensive formation. She designated her most damaged ships as the rear guard, and she did not pretend about what that meant. Home. The crews knew it too, and there was a terrible silence on the channels as the assignments were given. A silence that lasted only a moment before the rear guard captains acknowledged their orders and turned their ships to face the pursuing human forces. They fought, and they died, and they bought time with their lives, and Kalith honored them by not wasting what they gave her. The surviving ships pushed for the slipstream entry points, under whatever cover the rear guard could provide, and one by one they folded space around themselves and vanished from the Sol system. But not all of them made it. Ships with damaged drives failed to enter slipstream and were left behind. Ships that entered slipstream with structural damage broke apart in transit, crushed by the compressed space corridor that required perfect hull integrity to survive. Ships that made it into slipstream but had lost navigation systems emerged in the wrong locations. Empty space, light years from any friendly port. The fleet bled ships at every stage of the retreat, and Kalith could do nothing but watch the numbers fall. Meanwhile on Earth, the guns fell silent one by one, as the last Vethrani ships disappeared from sensor range. In the deep command bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, General Secretary Lena Vasquez sat in her chair and allowed herself 30 seconds of silence before the next crisis demanded her attention. The battle was won, but the cost was staggering. Over 8,000 human military personnel were dead, along with nearly 3,000 civilians, who had been aboard orbital stations and belt installations that took direct hits. Massive sections of Earth's orbital infrastructure were destroyed. Communication satellites, power stations, shipyards, and habitation rings that had taken decades to build were now expanding clouds of debris. The moon's surface was scarred with impact craters from Vethrani. Weapons that had targeted the longbow installations, and 2 of the railgun arrays were completely destroyed. Humanity had won, but it did not feel like victory. It felt like surviving a car crash, the relief of being alive mixed with the shock of how close it had come. Vasquez faced a decision in the hours that followed that would define humanity's future. Her military advisors were divided. The Hawks, led by Admiral Chen Wei of the Pacific Fleet Command, argued for pursuit. Several disabled Vethrani ships had been captured intact during the battle, and their slipstream drives could be reverse-engineered, possibly within months. "We have their technology now," Chen said, his voice tight with urgency. "And we know where they came from because their navigation databases are intact. So we can follow them back and hit them before they have time to rebuild and send a second fleet." The Doves, led by Director Amara Singh of the Diplomatic Intelligence Bureau, argued for restraint. "We have proven we can defend ourselves," Singh said, "and that message is more powerful than any attack fleet we can send, because it changes the equation for every species in this galaxy, not just the Vethrani." Vasquez listened to both sides, and she thought about the dead, the miners on the Helena, the soldiers on the orbital platforms, the civilians who had simply been in the wrong place when the sky caught fire. She made her decision. "We are not them," she said quietly. "We defended our home, and that is enough, for now." But she authorized one final action. Using captured Vethrani communication equipment calibrated to broadcast on every frequency the Vethrani military used, humanity sent a message into the void. It was not long, and it was not a threat, and it was not a boast. It was addressed to the conclave, and it said, "We did not start this. We finished it. Send no more fleets. The next time, we will not wait for you to come to us." The message traveled at the speed of light in every direction, and every species with the technology to intercept it heard the words of a civilization that had just fought off the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and survived. On the bridge of the Void Sovereign, now deep in slipstream transit, Kalith Sorvan sat alone in her quarters and reviewed the casualty figures for the 100th time. 9,500 ships dispatched. Fewer than 400 had made it to slipstream. And the slipstream corridor to Serethis Prime was long, and many of her ships were damaged, and damaged ships did not survive long transits. She set down the report and stared at the wall and tried to calculate how many would actually make it home. The number she arrived at made her close her eyes. It was a very small number. They dispatched 9,500 ships to attack Earth. Only 17 returned. Part 5, 17. The first ship appeared above Serethis Prime on a morning when the sky was clear, and the twin moons hung low on the horizon like pale watching eyes. It came out of slipstream badly, the exit ruptured jagged and unstable, and the ship that emerged was barely recognizable as a Vethrani warship. Its hull was torn open in a dozen places, and its engines flickered with the uneven pulse of systems running on emergency power, and half its weapons arrays were gone, ripped away by impacts that had bent the metal like paper. The orbital defense stations above the capital world locked weapons on it automatically, before identifying it as the cruiser Starbound Vigil. Registry confirmed. Crew complement reduced from 400 to 61. It was the first ship home from Sol. Over the next 3 days, more came. They arrived alone or in pairs, limping out of slipstream like wounded animals, dragging themselves back to the den. Each one more damaged than the last, Some had to be towed to dock because their engines failed during the final approach. Some had sealed entire sections of their hull to vacuum because there was no longer enough power to maintain atmospheric containment throughout the ship. One destroyer called the Pale Current arrived with its bridge completely destroyed, and its crew navigating from a makeshift command post in the engine room. When the last ship arrived, and the count was finalized, the number was broadcast across every communication network on Serethis Prime, and across every world in the Conclave. 17. 17 ships had returned, from an armada of 9,500. The number spread through the Conclave like a disease. On military worlds, where cadets trained in academies that had produced officers for millennia, the instructors had no framework to teach what had happened, because nothing like it had ever happened. Industrial worlds, where the shipyards had spent years building the armada, workers stared at production schedules that now meant nothing because the fleet those schedules were meant to supply no longer existed. On the capital world, the political structure of the conclave began to fracture along lines that had been invisible for thousands of years. Some arbiters demanded an immediate second attack, a full mobilization of every remaining warship in conclave space, an armada 10 times the size of the first, enough firepower to turn the entire Sol system into ash. Others argued for diplomacy, for contact, for some kind of negotiated agreement that would contain the human threat without another catastrophic military expenditure. A few said nothing at all, because they were too busy quietly calculating how to position themselves in whatever new political order was about to emerge. And in the middle of all of it, Fleet Marshal Kaylet Sorvon stood before the full assembly of the conclave and delivered her report. She had not slept in 4 days. Her uniform was clean, because she had insisted on that much dignity, but her face was drawn, and her eyes carried the weight of 9,483 ships that would never come home. She told them everything. She told them about the railguns that hurled metal at a fraction of light speed, and shattered shields that had never been breached before. She told them about the drone swarms that moved like living clouds and ate warships alive from the outside in. She told them about the distributed intelligence that had no center and no weakness, and that learned their tactics faster than they could change them. She told them about the mining ship, crewed by 12 civilians, who had rammed a dreadnought and killed it. She told them about the pursuit, about the weapons hidden at the slipstream entry points, about how the humans had planned not just to defend, but to ensure that nothing escaped. And when she was finished, she stood in silence for a moment, and then she said the words that would be repeated in every language on every world in the conclave for generations. "We did not lose because they were stronger," she said. "Ship for ship, we were superior in every way. Our weapons hit harder, our shields held longer, our crews were better trained." She paused. "We lost because they were ready, because they had spent their entire existence preparing for exactly this kind of fight. Not against us specifically, but against anything and everything, including themselves. Their weapons were crude, but they were effective, because the humans did not build elegant weapons. They built weapons that worked, and they built so many of them that elegance became irrelevant. Their tactics were chaotic, but that chaos was their strength, because we could not predict an enemy that did not follow doctrine. In real time, that adapted faster than our command structure could issue new orders. Fighting them was like fighting a virus. Every time we found a counter, they mutated. Every time we struck a blow, they absorbed it, and changed, and came back different." She looked across the chamber at the assembled arbiters, at the leaders of an empire that had ruled unchallenged for 12,000 years, and she saw fear in their eyes for the first time. "I recommend in the strongest possible terms that the conclave never engage humanity again," she said. A murmur ran through the chamber, and she raised her hand to silence it. "Not because we cannot win," she continued. "Perhaps with the full combined military strength of every world in the conclave, we could assemble a force large enough to overwhelm their defenses and burn their planet to glass. But the cost would break this empire, and I am no longer certain that burning their planet would stop them. She let that statement hang in the air. That statement hang in the air. They are the kind of species that would survive extinction out of pure spite, and they would spend however long it took crawling out of the ashes and building new weapons and finding us. And when they found us, they would not send a message first. The chamber was silent. Kaylet stepped back from the podium, and the silence followed her like a shadow. On Earth, 1 year had passed since the battle. The scars were still visible, debris fields in orbit that would take decades to clear, craters on the moon where railgun platforms had been destroyed, memorials in every city on every continent bearing the names of those who had died. But the scars were healing, and something new was growing in their place. In a laboratory buried beneath the lunar surface, Adaze Okonkwo stood before a machine that should not have existed. She was 27 now, no longer a PhD student, but the lead researcher of Project Threshold, most classified scientific endeavor in human history. The machine in front of her was built from pieces of Vethrani technology, recovered from captured and disabled warships, reverse-engineered over 12 months by teams of scientists and engineers who slept in shifts and lived on caffeine and stubbornness. It was a slipstream drive, a human-built slipstream drive. It was ugly compared to the Vethrani originals, bulkier, less refined, held together in places by solutions that were more creative than elegant. But the diagnostics were green, and the power readings were stable, and the mathematics said it would work. Adaze looked at it, and she thought about the night in the Karoo Desert when she had seen the anomaly on her screen. The night the universe had announced that humanity was not alone by sending 9,500 warships to kill them. She thought about the miners on the Helena, and the soldiers on the orbital platforms, and the young technician on the moon who had whispered, "Here they come," before the railguns fired. She thought about all of it, and then she reached out and pressed the activation switch. The drive hummed to life. It was a small sound, barely louder than a heartbeat, but it was the sound of a door opening, a door that could never be closed again. Adaze smiled. Humanity was no longer bound to a single star. And somewhere across the galaxy, in a chamber carved from a mountain on a world called Serethis Prime, the rulers of an empire that had never known fear were learning to sleep with their lights on, because the humans were coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon.